The manila folder hidden inside the wooden box felt far too thick, carrying a heavy stiffness that had nothing to do with paper. It smelled of fresh beeswax and dried lavender, resting completely out of place among the towering silver packages on the country club gift table. I had just set it down, but my fingers still remembered the cold, sharp edges of the unsigned legal documents inside. At 68 years old, a retired master carpenter like me knows when a structure is about to bear too much pressure. My name is Calvin Mercer, and I was watching my son's new wife dismantle my family's legacy without opening a single envelope. Brittany picked up the handmade walnut box. Her long acrylic nails clicked sharply against the lid, a hollow tapping sound that cut right through the soft jazz playing across the reception hall. She wore a white silk gown that probably cost more than the first truck I ever bought. Evan stood right beside her, holding a crystal champagne flute. My 38-year-old son looked handsome in his rented tuxedo, but his shoulders were stiff. His bride held the box up to the light. The chandelier crystals cast fractured shadows across the smooth grain. I had spent 3 days polishing that wood, trying to make it perfect for this early autumn evening. Then she saw the scratch. It was a small groove near the brass hinge. The 36-year-old woman ran her thumb over the mark and let out a sharp, breathless laugh. She turned to her bridesmaids, holding the box out by her fingertips, as if it were covered in dirt. "Is this a joke?" she asked, and her voice carried over the music. "Did he get this at a flea market?" A few of the bridesmaids giggled, and the guests standing near the table went quiet. "It is handmade," I said, stepping forward. My voice came out steady, even though my chest felt tight. Evan's mother built it. Brittany tilted her head, her smile tight and pitying. She looked at my outdated suit, then back at the box. "That is sweet, Calvin, really. But we are going to need a lot of space for the real gifts. Maybe we can put this in the garage." I looked at Evan. He was a grown man with a successful career, but right then he looked like a terrified boy. He knew exactly what that box was. 35 years ago, Helen and I stood in our dusty garage, building that exact box together. We were just a young couple then, restoring a ruined historic house with our bare hands. My chisel had slipped on the walnut, leaving that deep scratch near the hinge. I wanted to start over, but Helen simply brushed the sawdust from my cheek and smiled. She told me to leave it. She said perfection was for factories, and character was for a home. We built that box to hold our most important family documents. It sat on our fireplace mantel for his entire childhood. He recognized it instantly, and I saw his eyes widen. His hand twitched, and he instinctively reached out to take the box from his new wife. He was going to protect his mother's memory. But Brittany saw the movement. She did not yell. She did not even say a word. She simply turned her head and shot him a flat, freezing glare. Evan froze. His hand hovered in the air for 2 long seconds. I waited for my son to defend his mother, to take the box and silence the laughter. Instead, the groom slowly lowered his arm. He looked down at the polished marble floor and took a sip of his champagne. He chose to let her mock the very foundation of his life, just to keep the peace. That silence from my son broke something inside me that no tool could ever fix. Brittany smirked, satisfied with his obedience. She moved to toss the walnut box onto a pile of discarded wrapping paper at the end of the table. I closed the distance between us in 3 long strides. "Excuse me," I said, reaching out. I took the box firmly from her hands before she could drop it. The wood felt warm against my palms. Brittany blinked, startled by the sudden movement. Her practiced smile slipped for a fraction of a second, and she asked what I was doing. "I understand," I told her quietly. "You understand what?" I did not answer. I tucked the box securely under my arm, turned my back on the crystal chandeliers, and walked out of the reception hall. No one stopped me. The jazz band started playing a new song, and the party swallowed my absence instantly. The early autumn air felt crisp as I walked across the empty parking lot. I climbed into the cab of my old truck and shut the heavy metal door, sealing out the noise of the wedding. For a long time, I just sat there in the dark, resting my hands on the steering wheel. I reached over and unlatched the brass hinge of the box. The thick manila folder waited quietly on the velvet lining. Brittany thought she was rejecting a piece of junk. She did not know what the envelope contained. Inside was the legal deed to a property worth over $1 million. The house Helen and I had restored. The home I had promised to give them as a wedding present. But the transfer was not complete. The paperwork was sitting in escrow, and it required my final, written authorization to release it. I slipped my hand past the legal documents and pulled out a small, sealed envelope. Helen had passed away 5 years ago, but she had written this note just weeks before she left us. I broke the old seal and unfolded the paper. Her handwriting was weak, but the words were clear. Rough wood may carry scars, but a well-cut joint is what keeps a house standing. Anyone who judges the surface will never deserve the home built beneath it. I ran my thumb over the ink, feeling the truth of her warning. They thought they already owned everything. They had no idea I was about to cancel the entire future they had planned. 3 days passed since the wedding reception, and my hands needed something to do. The sticky window hinge in the old dining room gave me the perfect excuse to drive out to the property. Working on this house always settled my mind. The morning air carried a sharp autumn chill, smelling of dry pine needles and damp soil, while the sky hung pale and gray above the neighborhood. I wore my faded canvas work jacket and a heavy leather tool belt, expecting to find an empty, quiet house. Instead, a black luxury sport utility vehicle and a shiny silver pickup truck sat parked right in the middle of my gravel driveway. Evan had a spare key on his keychain. My son must have given it to his new bride, assuming the property was already theirs to use. My work boots crunched against the gravel, and I stopped at the front door to listen. Voices echoed from the kitchen area, loud and incredibly confident. I pushed the heavy oak door open, stepping onto the original floorboards Helen and I had laid by hand over 3 decades ago. 2 strangers stood over the kitchen island. A man in a tight blue polo shirt held a digital measuring tape against the custom cabinetry, while a woman in a sharp gray blazer made rapid notes on an electronic tablet. Neither of them belonged here. The man looked up, his eyes sweeping over my worn boots, my faded denim jeans, and the sawdust clinging to my jacket. He did not ask my name. The stranger did not even ask what I was doing inside the house. Finally, the man said, pointing a thick finger toward the dining room. The bride said someone was coming to clear out the scrap. Make sure you rip out those custom cabinets, buddy. We need a clean slate before the bulldozers get here next week. My jaw tightened, and the muscles in my neck pulled rigid. Bulldozers. The word hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. I kept my mouth shut, walking slowly toward the dining room window frame, and pulled a flathead screwdriver from my tool belt. Are we absolutely sure about the timeline, Rick? The woman asked, tapping her stylus against the glass screen. I cannot list a custom build if the current owner is dragging his feet on the deed transfer. The developer waved his large hand dismissively. Brittany assured me the old man is signing it over this week. It was a wedding gift. Once the transfer hits the county records, we knock this eyesore down. You will have your luxury listing ready to pre-sell by spring. My chest felt tight, but my hands remained steady. I turned the screw into the brass hinge, fixing the window, just letting them talk. They were planning to destroy 40 years of memories, and Brittany had authorized the destruction before she even owned the dirt under their feet. The sheer arrogance of it made the blood pound in my ears. Rick walked over to the dining room and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a crisp $20 bill, folded it in half, and tossed it onto the windowsill right next to my hand. Buy yourself a decent lunch, Rick said, turning his back to me and looking out at the yard. Just make sure this place is gutted by Friday. The green paper sat there on the brass sill. I left the money exactly where it fell. On my way out, I passed the kitchen island and noticed 2 glossy business cards resting next to the sink. One belonged to Rick, a local luxury real estate developer. The other belonged to a high-end property broker. I slid both cards into my pocket and walked out the back door without making a sound. The cool autumn breeze hit my face, bringing a small measure of relief, but it did not calm the steady rhythm thumping against my ribs. As I rounded the corner of the detached garage, a familiar voice called out. Mrs. Gable, the elderly widow who lived next door, was leaning against the wooden fence holding a pair of rusted gardening shears. Calvin, she said, her thin eyebrows pulled together in a tight frown. I thought you were renting the place out. Your new daughter-in-law came by yesterday, making quite a scene. I stopped walking and asked her exactly what she meant. The neighbor shook her head, gesturing toward the beautiful wrap-around porch Helen had designed. Brittany was standing right there in the front yard, telling anyone who would listen that she was replacing this old shack with a modern mansion. She was bragging about cashing out the neighborhood. I told her it was a shame to tear down such good bones, and she just laughed at me. My hands curled into fists inside my pockets, and the sharp corners of the business cards dug deep into my knuckles. The mockery at the wedding reception was not just a lapse in judgment or a brief moment of arrogance. Brittany had brought strangers into my home, priced out the timber, and scheduled the demolition of my life's work. She had done all of this while smiling in her white silk dress, drinking champagne paid for by the very wealth she planned to extract from my family. Nodding in, thanks to Mrs. Gable, I walked over to my truck and climbed inside the cab. The familiar smell of old leather and engine oil usually grounded me, but today it offered absolutely no comfort. The deed to the house still sat securely inside a manila folder at my lawyer's office, waiting for my signature. Brittany thought the paperwork was a mere formality. She thought I was just a tired, foolish old man who would quietly fade away and let her pave over my family history. Pulling my cell phone from the dashboard console, I dialed a number I had known for 20 years. Law offices of David Stern, the receptionist answered. "This is Calvin Mercer," I said, my voice finally losing its quiet restraint. "I need to speak to David right now. Tell him we need to talk about the escrow." The drive to David Stern's office took less than 20 minutes, but the steady thumping against my ribs made the journey feel like hours. Dry autumn leaves blew across the windshield of my truck, a stark reminder of the changing seasons and the cold reality settling over my family. I kept gripping the steering wheel, feeling the rough calluses on my palms. Those hands had built the custom cabinetry that a stranger with a digital measuring tape was currently planning to rip apart. The law firm occupied the second floor of an old brick building downtown, carrying the familiar smells of roasted coffee beans and lemon floor polish. I walked straight past the empty reception desk, my heavy work boots thudding against the carpet, and knocked twice on the frosted glass of David's door. The attorney looked up from his computer monitor, pushing his silver wire frames down the bridge of his nose. David had handled my family's legal affairs for over 2 decades. He was the man who had helped Helen and me build the exact legal framework that was currently keeping my life from falling apart. "Calvin," David said, immediately standing up and gesturing toward the leather guest chairs. "Come in and sit down. You sounded entirely out of breath on the phone. What exactly is going on?" I sank into the heavy leather chair, resting my tired hands on my knees. Taking a slow, deep breath, I told him everything. I explained the wedding reception, the cruel laughter echoing around the crystal chandeliers, and the way Brittany had mocked the handmade wooden box. Then I told him about the real estate developer standing in my kitchen just an hour ago, openly discussing the demolition timeline while throwing a $20 bill on my windowsill. David stopped taking notes on his yellow legal pad. He stared at me across the massive mahogany desk, looking genuinely bewildered. "They are planning to bulldoze the property?" the attorney asked, his voice completely flat. "How exactly do they plan to accomplish that without a recorded deed?" My old friend reached into his bottom filing cabinet and pulled out a thick manila folder. It was the exact twin of the folder I had placed inside the wooden wedding box. David slapped the heavy file onto the center of his desk and opened it, revealing dozens of pages of dense legal text printed on thick paper. "Let us be absolutely clear about where you stand right now," David said, tapping his brass pen against the top document. "Your property is held entirely within a revocable living trust. You and Helen established this trust years ago to protect your assets, and since she passed away, you are the sole trustee. That means you are the only human being on this earth who has the legal authority to sell, modify, or transfer that house." I looked at the towering stack of papers, feeling the cold knot of anxiety in my stomach slowly begin to loosen. But I handed them the presentation folder at the wedding. "Brittany thinks she already owns the land, and Evan let her believe it." David let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "She can think whatever she wants, but the law does not operate on her assumptions. The folder you gave them contained a declaration of intent, which is essentially a ceremonial piece of paper. The actual, legally binding transfer package is sitting right here in my office, locked safely in escrow." The lawyer flipped through the file and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the polished wood toward me. I looked down at the page. It contained a few paragraphs of dense legal terminology and one solid black line at the very bottom, waiting for a signature. "This is the final authorization requirement," David explained, leaning forward and folding his hands together. "When we set up the escrow instructions, we specifically designed the process to require this final piece of paper. Until you sign this document in my presence, releasing the deed from escrow, absolutely nothing happens. The title remains firmly in your name. The trust remains intact. There is no sale contract, and there is certainly no legal foundation for a demolition crew." I stared at the blank signature line for a long time. Helen had insisted on this extra layer of protection when we first drafted the paperwork. My wife had always possessed a quiet wisdom about human nature, understanding that people often revealed their true character only when they thought they had finally secured what they wanted. She wanted to make sure I had an emergency brake to pull if things went wrong. Right now, her foresight felt like a warm hand resting on my shoulder. "Nothing can happen without me," I whispered. the reality of the situation finally settling deep into my bones. Not a single thing, David confirmed, pulling the paper back and placing it safely inside the folder. Brittany has zero legal interest in your property. The new bride is making promises to luxury developers with empty hands. If she signed any kind of preliminary agreement with that real estate broker, she committed fraud by misrepresenting her ownership. A heavy silence filled the office, broken only by the low hum of the ceiling air conditioning vent. The sheer magnitude of Brittany's greed was staggering, but her arrogance had created a perfect trap. She was moving forward with a massive financial gamble, completely blind to the fact that I still held every single string. I looked up at my attorney and asked the question that had been forming in my mind since I left the empty house. What happens if I tell you to cancel the escrow permanently? What if I want to draft a trust amendment? David did not hesitate. He simply reached for his pen. Then we terminate the escrow agreement. The house stays in your trust, and we sit down to discuss exactly how you want your legacy distributed. Before I could tell him to start the cancellation paperwork, my cell phone vibrated violently against my thigh. I pulled the device from my pocket and saw a new text message from Evan. The bright screen illuminated the shadows of the quiet office, and I read the words twice to make sure my aging eyes were working correctly. Dad, the message read. Brittany booked a professional photographer to take the listing photographs of the house tomorrow morning. Can you go over there tonight and make sure all your old junk is cleared out of the garage? I stared at the glowing screen, feeling a cold, heavy sadness wash over the lingering anger. My own son was calling his mother's legacy junk, actively helping his wife sell a home she did not even own. They were marching straight toward the edge of a steep cliff, completely convinced they were building a luxury empire. I slid the phone back into my pocket, looked across the mahogany desk, and told David I would not be signing the authorization today. It was a little past 8 in the morning when my old truck rattled onto the street behind my property. I decided to park 2 blocks away from the driveway, cutting the engine and rolling down the window. The morning mist still clung to the branches of the ancient oak trees Helen and I had planted 30 years ago. My cell phone buzzed against my leg. Pulling the device from my pocket, I read a new text message from Evan. He wanted to know if I was at the house yet, adding that Brittany needed the garage cleared out before the photographer got to the backyard. I locked the screen and slid the phone away into my jacket. My own son was managing my eviction. The walk down the alley felt entirely foreign. I used my original brass key to unlock the back mudroom door, pushing it open with a quiet click. The house instantly smelled wrong. Heavy floral perfume had completely masked the familiar scent of old pine and lemon wax. 2 voices echoed from the front living room, followed by the rapid mechanical clicking of a professional camera shutter. "Get the angle from the fireplace next, please," Brittany said. Her voice carried that sharp, demanding edge she normally reserved for waitstaff at restaurants. "We have to show the total lot size through that front window. The luxury buyers need to know they have plenty of room to dig the infinity pool." "The morning lighting is absolutely perfect right now," another woman replied. It was the realtor from the business card I had found on the counter yesterday. "We are going to list this as a prime tear-down opportunity. You are going to make an absolute fortune on this dirt, Brittany." Standing completely still in the hallway, I let the shadows hide me. I felt like a ghost haunting my own home. My jaw ached from grinding my teeth, but I needed to see exactly what they were planning before making my presence known. Keeping my heavy work boots light on the floorboards, I moved silently into the kitchen. That was when I saw what they had left, spread across the granite island. A massive piece of white foam board leaned against the fruit bowl. It was covered in glossy magazine clippings, paint swatches, and printed architectural sketches. I walked closer to the counter and studied the display. The board featured pictures of a massive glass and steel mansion, a temperature-controlled wine cellar, a 4-car garage with glass doors. It was a towering monument to excessive wealth, completely erasing the modest home my wife and I had built with our own hands. Next to the mood board sat a thick stack of printed papers. The top page was a draft of a real estate listing. I picked up the heavy cardstock and read the bold text. It described a unique opportunity to build a dream estate in a historic neighborhood, noting that the current structure would be demolished by the end of the month. The description ended with 3 words that made my stomach turn. Seller highly motivated. Brittany was already calling herself the seller. She had not even waited for the ink to dry on a deed she had never actually seen. I set the listing down and noticed an email chain printed and tucked beneath the folders. The top of the page showed Evan's email address copied on the message thread. It was a conversation between Brittany and the real estate broker from late last night. "We do not need to wait for Calvin to move his old junk," Brittany had written in the email. My husband says his dad does not need a house this big anyway. Evan told me the old man is practically begging us to take it off his hands. I stared at those words for a long time, listening to the high-pitched laughter coming from my living room. My husband says. Evan had not just stayed silent at the wedding reception to avoid a public scene. My son was actively handing over his mother's memory behind my back. He was feeding my dignity to his greedy wife, just to keep her happy and maintain their perfect image. A cold, heavy weight settled over my chest, pressing down on my lungs until I had to take a slow, deep breath just to keep standing. I had spent 40 years teaching that boy the value of hard work, respect, and honesty. We had spent countless weekends in this very yard, fixing the roof and painting the trim together. Now, he was throwing all of that history away for the illusion of status, convincing himself that I was just a tired old man ready to be pushed aside. I flipped to the second page of the printed packet. It was a professional land survey of my property. The map showed the main house, the sprawling backyard, and the detached workshop sitting near the rear fence line. Someone had taken a thick red marker and drawn a massive cross right over the workshop. Next to the red ink, Brittany had written a note in her looping, elegant handwriting. Bulldoze this structure first. Full of useless garbage. My vision narrowed entirely to that red ink, and my hands started to shake. I pressed my palms flat against the cold granite counter to steady myself. That workshop was not just a storage shed. It was where Helen had spent the last 20 years of her life, carving beautiful wooden bowls and building furniture for our neighbors. It was the exact place where we had carefully sanded and stained the wooden gift box they had mocked just 3 days ago. Every single tool inside that building carried the memory of her touch, and the smell of her favorite varnish still hung in the wooden rafters. To Brittany, 40 years of love, sweat, and craftsmanship was nothing but useless garbage standing in the way of her new swimming pool. The camera shutter stopped clicking in the front room. The photographer told Brittany they were ready to step outside and take the exterior shots of the property. I did not wait to introduce myself or confront them in the kitchen. Setting the paper down exactly where I found it, I turned around and walked out the back door. I stepped off the porch, heading straight across the wet morning grass toward the heavy wooden doors of the old workshop. The heavy wooden doors of the old workshop protested with a familiar, low groan as I pushed them apart. Stepping over the threshold, I left the sharp clicking of the real estate photographer's camera far behind me. The morning sunlight cut through the high, dust-coated windows, casting long beams across the massive oak workbench that dominated the center of the room. The air in here felt entirely different from the main house, carrying the rich, settled scent of linseed oil, aged cedar, and the faint metallic tang of cold cast-iron tools. This space held the quiet weight of Helen's memory, completely untouched by the aggressive greed infecting the kitchen just a few yards away. I walked past the heavy bandsaw and ran my calloused hand along the smooth edge of the work table. Helen had built this table herself, spending weeks sanding the grain until it felt like polished glass. I had retrieved the walnut gift box from my truck, and I set the empty container gently on the center of the bench. The empty wooden box sat there as a stark reminder of everything my son and his new wife had rejected. It was meant to hold a deed for a family that understood the value of hard work, but instead, it had become a mirror, reflecting exactly who Evan and Brittany really were. Reaching down, I opened the bottom drawer of the rolling tool chest. Helen's leather-bound journals and stacks of old workshop photos sat exactly where she had left them 5 years ago. I pulled out a handful of the heavy notebooks and flipped through the thick, yellowed pages. Detailed sketches of dovetail joints, measurements for a neighbor's dining room table, and small notes written in her elegant cursive filled the margins. A faded photograph slipped from between the pages and fluttered down to the concrete floor. I picked up the picture and brushed a layer of sawdust from the glossy surface. The image showed Evan at 10 years old, standing right here in this workshop, proudly holding a crooked wooden birdhouse he had nailed together. Helen was kneeling beside him in her denim overalls, pointing out a splintered edge with a wide, encouraging smile. She had always said that working with wood taught a person patience, humility, and a deep respect for the things that last. My son's wife had looked at a land survey of this sacred space and marked it with a thick, red cross, calling 40 years of love and craftsmanship useless garbage. Evan had simply nodded along, too cowardly to defend the very walls that raised him. Looking around the quiet room, surrounded by the tools my wife had loved, the cold knot of sadness in my chest finally broke apart. It was replaced by a clear, sharp certainty. They wanted to tear this legacy down and bury it under a luxury swimming pool. I was going to make it permanent. The idea for a woodworking education foundation took root in my mind, offering a way to preserve the property and share the craft with a new generation. I reached into my canvas jacket, pulled out my cell phone, and called David Stern again. This time, I did not ask my attorney for advice or explanations. I gave him a direct, uncompromising order. 2 hours later, I walked back into the downtown law office and sat down in the leather guest chair. David was already typing rapidly on his computer keyboard, pausing only to confirm the specific details of my request. "You understand the permanence of what we are doing here?" the lawyer asked, peering over the rim of his silver glasses. "You are completely restructuring the distribution of your assets." I nodded, staring at the fresh stack of legal paper resting on his mahogany desk. Evan lost his right to inherit the real estate the moment he let Brittany price out the demolition. "Write the charter exactly as we discussed." The attorney turned his attention back to the monitor, adjusting the legal phrasing to establish the parameters of the new organization. "We were building a vocational scholarship foundation in Helen's name, ensuring the house and the workshop would become an educational center for local teenagers. The land would serve the community, honoring the exact skills and values that had built it, entirely protected from ambitious real estate developers." David printed the final documents and slid the thick stack across the desk. I picked up his heavy brass pen, feeling the cool metal press against my knuckles. Without a single second of hesitation, the trust amendment was signed, legally sealing the fate of the property forever. "It is done," David said, placing the signed paper into a new, secure folder. "The house belongs to the foundation. Now, what do you want me to do about the escrow package?" "Cancel it," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of doubt. The attorney prepared the formal cancellation of the escrow, taking the original manila folder and striking a heavy red line across the cover page. The unexecuted deed was now entirely void, severing any lingering connection to the wedding gift they had so casually mocked. "I will file the termination notice immediately," David stated, setting the voided folder aside. "How exactly do you want to handle the notification process for your son and his wife?" I leaned back in the heavy chair, picturing Brittany standing in my kitchen, barking orders at her photographer and dreaming about the millions she was about to make. She needed to hear the truth in a room where her anger could not manipulate the outcome. "Call Evan," I told the attorney, keeping my eyes locked on the voided folder. "Tell him the paperwork is ready for the final step, and a formal meeting needs to be scheduled for tomorrow morning." David picked up his office phone with a subtle, understanding nod. They were going to walk into this building tomorrow, expecting to receive the keys to a luxury empire, completely unaware that the doors had already been permanently locked. David Stern held his morning meetings in a large conference room that smelled of fresh coffee and old paper. The heavy mahogany table sat perfectly polished under the warm overhead lights, completely free of any clutter. Evan and Brittany arrived exactly on time, walking through the glass doors looking like they were stepping into a victory celebration. My daughter-in-law wore a pristine white blazer and held a designer leather handbag in her lap. She sat with her back straight, a confident, practiced smile resting on her face. My son sat beside her, looking relaxed in a fitted blue suit. They fully believed they were here to collect the keys to their new luxury empire. I sat across from them, keeping my hands folded quietly on my lap. David took his seat at the head of the table. The attorney did not smile. He simply opened his leather briefcase, pulled out the thick manila folder, and placed it flat on the polished wood. A thick red line was drawn diagonally across the front cover. Brittany leaned forward, her manicured fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the table. "Is that the final deed, David? We have a very tight schedule today. The demolition crew is finalizing their timeline, and we really need to get those keys copied before lunch." David adjusted his silver glasses, looking at her with absolute clinical precision. "There are no keys to distribute today, Brittany. I called this meeting to inform you both that the escrow holding the property transfer has been officially and permanently terminated." The room went completely silent. The quiet hum of the air conditioning vent suddenly sounded incredibly loud. Evan blinked, his relaxed posture instantly dissolving. He looked at the lawyer, then turned to look at me, confusion pulling at the corners of his eyes. "Terminated?" Evan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean terminated? Dad gave us the house at the wedding." "Your father presented you with a ceremonial box," David corrected smoothly, resting his hands on the voided folder. "The actual, legally binding transfer package was held in my office. It required your father to provide a final written authorization to release the deed. He has chosen to withhold that authorization, and the trust has been restructured. The property remains entirely in his name. The confident smile vanished from Brittany's face. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very sharp. She stood up from her leather chair, planting both hands flat on the mahogany table. "That is completely illegal," the new bride said, her voice rising in pitch. "You gave us that house, Calvin. You gave it to us in front of 200 guests. We already made plans. We already signed preliminary agreements with a luxury developer. You cannot just change your mind because you woke up in a bad mood." I looked up at the woman who had laughed at my wife's memory, and my heartbeat stayed remarkably steady. "You signed agreements for a piece of land you did not own. That was your choice, Brittany. You assumed the property was yours because you never bothered to actually look at what I handed you. You handed me a cheap, scratched-up piece of junk," she snapped, no longer bothering to hide the venom in her voice. "And now you are trying to steal our future." I reached into the inner pocket of my canvas jacket and pulled out the small, sealed envelope. The paper felt familiar and grounding against my fingertips. Unfolding the letter, I placed it on the table between us. "Helen and I built that box together 35 years ago," I said, speaking clearly so every word would land exactly where it needed to go. "We made it to hold the deed for this family. But before she died, my wife wrote this letter. She asked me to keep it inside the box until the day I finally passed the house on to the next generation." Evan stared at the faded handwriting. His breathing turned shallow. "Rough wood may carry scars, but a well-cut joint is what keeps a house standing," I read aloud, letting the words fill the quiet conference room. "Anyone who judges the surface will never deserve the home built beneath it." My son closed his eyes. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He finally understood that the wooden box was never just a container. It was a test, and they had failed it in front of a room full of witnesses. "I watched you look at that box at your wedding," I told my son, focusing entirely on his face. "You knew exactly what it was. You knew how much your mother loved it. When your wife laughed at her memory, you started to reach for it. You could have stopped her. You could have defended your family, but you pulled your hand back." Evan opened his eyes, and they were shining with unshed tears. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He simply looked down at his own hands, the shame radiating from every line in his posture. "Your silence told me everything I needed to know," I continued, keeping my voice quiet but firm. "You were willing to trade your mother's legacy for a little bit of peace with a woman who only values a price tag. That is why the escrow is canceled. That is why you will never own that house." Brittany sank back into her chair, her designer bag sliding off her lap and hitting the floor with a heavy thud. She looked frantically at the lawyer. "David, you have to fix this," she pleaded, her professional mask completely shattered. "We leveraged the wedding debt against the projected sale of that lot. We owe the country club. We owe the catering company. We took out a massive bridge loan for our new apartment based on that property value." "I represent Calvin," David stated, his tone completely devoid of sympathy. "And legally speaking, you own absolutely nothing. You are holding debt backed by empty air." Before anyone could say another word, a loud, obnoxious, ringing tone erupted from the floor. Brittany stared down at her cell phone, which had spilled out of her fallen purse. The bright screen illuminated the dark carpet, flashing a name I recognized instantly. It was Rick, the local luxury developer she had brought into my kitchen. He was calling to collect on a promise she could no longer keep. The bright screen of the cell phone illuminated the dark carpet of the law office. Brittany stared at the flashing name, her hands trembling as she reached down to pick it up. The luxury developer was not calling to offer congratulations. She swiped the screen to answer and pressed the phone against her ear, but the volume was loud enough for the entire mahogany conference room to hear Rick shouting on the other end of the line. He had just returned from the county records office. The developer had pulled the property files to verify the lot lines for his demolition crew, only to discover that the deed was still firmly held in my trust. There was no transfer, no sale, and no legal pathway for him to break ground next week. Rick demanded the return of his $50,000 holding deposit by the end of the business day. If the money was not in his account, he promised to file a massive lawsuit for fraud. Brittany lowered the phone, her face completely drained of color. The device slipped from her manicured fingers and clattered onto the polished table. David Stern sat perfectly still at the head of the table, his hands folded neatly over the voided escrow file. My attorney did not offer a single word of comfort, and I simply watched my daughter-in-law realize the exact price of her arrogance. "You have to sign the papers, Calvin," Brittany said, her voice dropping into a desperate, reedy whisper. "If Rick pulls out, the entire financial structure of our marriage collapses." We put down a non-refundable deposit on a penthouse apartment in the city. The bank approved a massive bridge loan based entirely on the appraised value of your lot. If we do not have collateral, they will recall the loan immediately." Before she could finish her sentence, Evan reached into his tailored blue suit jacket. He pulled out a thick stack of folded receipts and cancellation notices, tossing them onto the center of the table. The glossy white papers fanned out across the wood. I recognized the letterhead from the exclusive country club where they had hosted the wedding reception just 3 weeks ago. My son rubbed his hands over his face, looking older than his 38 years. He looked at the scattered papers and finally spoke. "The bridge loan is already gone, Brittany," Evan said, his voice completely hollow. "The loan officer emailed me this morning asking for the final deed recording. When I told him there was a delay, he flagged the account. The bank froze our line of credit 20 minutes before we walked into this building. We have no collateral, which means we have absolutely no way to pay the remaining balance on the wedding." The sheer scale of their recklessness settled heavily in the quiet room. They had hosted a lavish reception for 200 guests, pouring expensive champagne and posing for professional photographers, all while secretly burying themselves in crippling debt. They had treated my home like an unlimited bank account, ready to bulldoze 40 years of my life just to maintain the illusion of high society wealth. Brittany turned toward me, her desperation instantly hardening into a sharp, venomous rage. She slammed her hand against the mahogany table. "You planned this," the bride accused, her eyes wide and wild. "You gave us that wooden box on purpose just to humiliate me. You knew we were relying on that money to start our life together, and you set a trap to ruin us." I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, feeling the cool air conditioning brush past my shoulders. I did not raise my voice, and I did not flinch at her anger. "I gave you a handmade box built by a woman who knew the true value of a home," I replied smoothly, making sure my words carried absolute finality. "You built a trap out of your own greed, Brittany. You spent a fortune you did not earn, sold a house you did not own, and laughed at the people who tried to give you a foundation. I did not ruin your life. I simply refused to let you destroy mine." She opened her mouth to scream, another accusation, but a hand caught her wrist. Evan stood up, his jaw set in a hard, uncompromising line. "Stop," my son commanded. Brittany yanked her arm away, staring at her husband as if he had just been replaced by a stranger. "Are you actually taking his side? Your father is stealing our future." "We never had a future," Evan said softly, looking at the voided escrow folder. "We built a marriage on a pile of debt and a stolen house. Dad did not force us to sign those contracts, and he certainly did not force us to mock my mother's memory. We did that all on our own." For the first time since the wedding, my son was not hiding behind silence. He was standing in the wreckage of his own choices, finally taking responsibility for the damage he had allowed into our family. Brittany scoffed, a bitter and ugly sound that echoed in the quiet room. She grabbed her designer leather bag from the floor, turned on her heel, and marched out of the conference room without another word. The heavy glass door slammed shut behind her, rattling the framed diplomas on David's wall. Evan did not follow his wife. He stood quietly by the table, staring at the scattered country club receipts. The silence stretched out for a long time before he finally looked up at me. His eyes were red, carrying a deep, exhausted sorrow. "I am not asking for the house," Evan whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "I know I lost that right, but I need to apologize to you. Not here, and not in front of lawyers. Can I come by the old workshop tomorrow morning?" I looked at the man standing across from me, searching for the boy who used to help me sand wooden birdhouses in the garage. The anger that had carried me through the last 3 weeks slowly began to recede, leaving behind a quiet, cautious hope. "Tomorrow at 8, I told him, standing up from my chair. "Do not be late." The old digital clock on the workbench flipped to exactly 8 in the morning just as the heavy wooden doors groaned open. The morning light poured into the dusty room, illuminating the floating wood particles and the clean surface of the main table. Evan stepped over the threshold, looking entirely out of place. He wore a wrinkled button-down shirt and dark slacks, carrying the exhausted posture of a man who had not slept a single minute. He did not say a word when he walked inside, and I did not offer a greeting. I had brought my silver laptop down from the main house earlier that morning. It sat open on the oak workbench right next to the empty wooden gift box. The screen glowed brightly in the shadows of the garage, paused on a specific video file I had downloaded from the wedding photographer. My son stopped a few feet away from the table, staring at the empty box. His hands hung loosely by his sides, and the quiet sounds of the neighborhood birds seemed incredibly loud in the heavy silence. "Come over here," I told him gently, pointing toward the computer screen. I want to show you something before we talk about anything else. Evan walked around the table and stood beside me. I reached out and pressed the spacebar. The tinny audio from the small laptop speakers immediately filled the workshop. The recording showed the lavish country club reception, capturing the soft jazz band and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. On the screen, Brittany picked up the handmade walnut box. Her long acrylic nails tapped loudly against the lid. We watched her lift the gift by her fingertips, holding it up to the chandelier light before letting out that sharp, breathless laugh. We heard her ask the bridesmaids if I had bought the item at a flea market. Evan closed his eyes, unable to watch his wife mock his mother, but I did not stop the video. "Keep your eyes on the screen," I instructed, my voice firm enough to make him open them again. "Look at yourself." The camera panned slightly, catching my son standing right next to the bride. The footage showed his initial reaction perfectly. His eyes went wide with recognition, and his right arm instinctively reached out to take the box away from her. He was ready to protect his family. He was ready to do the right thing. Then, Brittany turned her head and shot him a completely silent, freezing glare. I pressed the spacebar again, freezing the video at the exact second Evan began to lower his arm. The loud reception noise vanished, leaving us standing in the quiet workshop. I turned away from the frozen image and looked at my son. "That right there is the exact moment you lost the house," I said, pointing at his frozen posture on the screen. It was not when she laughed. "I can forgive a stranger for not understanding the value of a handmade gift. But you knew exactly whose hands carved that wood. You knew how many hours your mother spent polishing that lid, and you let a greedy woman turn her memory into a punchline just so you would not have to start an argument." Evan stared at the frozen frame, his breathing turning shallow and ragged. The color completely drained from his face as he stared at his own cowardice captured in high definition. He reached out and gripped the edge of the workbench, leaning his weight against the solid oak. "I was terrified," the young man whispered, his voice cracking violently. "The wedding bills were piling up every single day, and we owed so much money to the venue. Brittany kept telling me that the house sale would fix everything. She convinced me that you would not care about the old place once we bought you a nice condo. I knew it was wrong, but I just wanted the pressure to stop. I am so incredibly sorry, Dad." Tears spilled over his lower lashes, dropping silently onto the dusty concrete floor. There was no theatrical sobbing or dramatic pleading. He was simply a broken man standing in the wreckage of a life he had dismantled with his own two hands. He finally understood that his silence had cost him the only inheritance that truly mattered. Before I could respond, a harsh buzzing sound vibrated against the wood. Evan had placed his cell phone on the table, and the screen illuminated with a rapid succession of incoming text messages. I glanced down and saw Brittany's name flashing repeatedly across the glass. The preview text was impossible to miss. She was furious, typing in all capital letters. The bride demanded that Evan force me to sign the papers, claiming I was trying to ruin her reputation. The next message blamed him for not reading the folder at the wedding, entirely refusing to accept any accountability for her own arrogant assumptions. She called my home a worthless pile of rotting timber, warning Evan not to come back to their apartment until the money was secured. My son stared at the glowing screen for a long time. He read every single word his wife had written, his jaw clenching tight. He did not type a response, and he did not try to defend her behavior. Instead, he reached out, picked up the device, and held down the power button until the screen went completely black. He set the dead phone face down next to the empty wooden box. "She is never going to understand what she did," Evan said quietly, wiping a hand across his wet face. "And I am never going to forgive myself for letting her do it." I looked around the workshop, breathing in the scent of aged cedar and linseed oil. The anger that had kept me awake for the past 3 weeks finally began to loosen its grip on my chest. I saw a man who had made a terrible mistake, but I also saw a son who was finally ready to carry the weight of his consequences. "I am always going to be your father," I told him, stepping closer and resting a heavy hand on his shoulder. "And I will always love you. I forgive you for what happened at that reception. But forgiveness does not mean we go back to the way things were." Evan nodded slowly, keeping his eyes focused on the floor. "I know. The trust is gone." "Yes, it is," I agreed, giving his shoulder a firm squeeze before letting go. "You proved that you cannot protect this family's legacy, so I have to protect it from you. You are going to have to figure out how to pay off your own debts, and you are going to have to decide what kind of man you want to be when you walk out of this garage." He finally looked up, offering a small, fragile nod of understanding. There was a long road ahead of him, but at least he was finally looking in the right direction. I closed the laptop, breaking the heavy tension in the room. Walking over to the main set of doors, I pushed them open a little wider to let the morning breeze sweep through the dust. "Now wipe your face," I instructed, looking out across the sprawling backyard toward the street. "A delivery truck is arriving in about 10 minutes, and I need you to help me carry some lumber. We have a lot of work to do before the community arrives tomorrow." The heavy delivery truck backed slowly down the gravel driveway, its reverse alarm echoing sharply against the quiet morning air. 10 minutes had passed since Evan turned off his cell phone, and my son was already standing by the open cargo doors with his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked tired, carrying the weight of his ruined marriage and the massive debt waiting for him back in the city. But he did not complain. When the driver dropped the heavy metal ramp, Evan reached in and grabbed the first stack of raw cedar planks. We spent the next 4 hours moving the wood from the truck into the old workshop. We worked in a comfortable, steady rhythm, measuring our steps and shifting our grip without needing to say a word. It felt exactly like the weekends we used to spend restoring the wrap-around porch when he was just a teenager. The physical labor was hard, pulling at the muscles in my back and leaving my hands covered in splinters, but the honest exhaustion felt incredibly clean compared to the legal battles of the past 3 weeks. By noon, the lumber was stacked neatly along the back wall, filling the garage with the sharp, fresh scent of cut cedar. I walked over to the center workbench and picked up a heavy brass plaque I had ordered from a local engraver. The metal felt cool against my calloused fingers. Holding it up to the light, I read the polished lettering, running my thumb over the deep grooves of my late wife's name. Helen Mercer Vocational Foundation, the plaque read. Beneath her name, the engraver had perfectly captured the final sentence of her letter. "Anyone who judges the surface will never deserve the home built beneath it." Evan walked up beside me, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He read the brass sign, his eyes lingering on his mother's quote for a long moment. "It looks beautiful, Dad," my son said quietly, his voice finally carrying a genuine, steady strength. "She would have loved this." "I think so too," I agreed, setting the plaque gently onto the oak table. "The attorney finished drafting the charter yesterday. The foundation will provide free woodworking apprenticeships and basic contracting skills to teenagers from the local high school. They are going to learn how to build cabinets, restore old floors, and swing a hammer properly. Most importantly, they are going to learn that a person's value is not measured by the cost of their clothes or the neighborhood they live in." I picked up the scratched wooden gift box, the very same one Brittany had mocked at the wedding reception. Opening the brass hinge, I placed the empty box exactly in the center of the workbench, positioning it right next to the new plaque. It was no longer a container holding a secret deed. It was a permanent piece of our history, standing as a quiet warning about the cost of arrogance and the true meaning of legacy. Evan reached out and touched the rough scratch near the hinge, tracing the line I had accidentally made 35 years ago. He did not pull his hand away this time. "I called a moving company this morning," Evan told me, keeping his focus on the wooden box. "I'm going back to the apartment to pack my things tonight. Brittany is furious, and she is already threatening to hire a divorce attorney to go after my income, but there are no assets left to divide. The bridge loan was canceled, and the wedding venue is threatening to send our account to collections by the end of the week. I am going to rent a small studio on the other side of town until I can figure out how to pay off my half of the debt." He was walking straight into a brutal financial storm, and the coming months were going to test him in ways he had never experienced. There would be legal threats, angry phone calls, and the humiliating reality of starting completely over at 38 years old. But looking at the steady set of his jaw, I knew he was finally ready to face it. "You are going to have to work incredibly hard to dig yourself out of this," I told him, looking him squarely in the eye. "I am not going to pay your bills, and I am not going to rescue you from the choices you made with that woman." "I know," Evan replied, meeting my gaze without looking away. "I am not asking for a bailout. I just want to earn my own life back." The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway interrupted the quiet moment. A dark blue sedan pulled up next to the house, and a woman holding a large clipboard stepped out. It was the director of the local vocational program, arriving to inspect the workshop before the first class of students officially started next week. I turned away from the table, grabbed a clean rag to wipe the sawdust from my hands, and walked toward the open garage doors to greet our first guest. The foundation was no longer just a legal document sitting in David Stern's office. It was real, breathing new life into the old property, and ensuring that Helen's memory would finally reach the next generation. As I shook the director's hand, another car turned onto our street. It moved much faster than the speed limit, its engine revving aggressively before slamming on the brakes right in front of my driveway. The bright white luxury SUV sat idling near the curb, completely blocking the entrance. The tinted driver's side window rolled down smoothly, revealing the furious, perfectly made-up face of my daughter-in-law. Brittany had come back for one final conversation, and she did not look like she was planning to leave quietly. The heavy car door slammed shut with a crack that echoed down the quiet suburban street, and Brittany marched up the gravel driveway. Her pristine, carefully curated image had completely unraveled overnight. Dark smudges of mascara shadowed her eyes, while her expensive silk blouse looked deeply wrinkled and haphazardly tucked in. She ignored the vocational director standing near the open garage doors, aiming her sharp, frantic glare directly at my son. "Get in the car right now, Evan," my daughter-in-law demanded, pointing a trembling finger toward the idling luxury vehicle. "My lawyer says if we file a joint lawsuit against the estate today, we can freeze the family trust before your father gives it all away. We can drag this out in court for years, until he settles. We can still save the penthouse." Evan did not move. He stood next to the oak workbench, wiping cedar dust from his hands with a clean canvas rag. The nervous exhaustion that usually hunched his shoulders seemed to vanish entirely, replaced by a quiet, immovable stillness. "There is no lawsuit, Brittany," he replied, keeping his voice perfectly level. "And there is no luxury penthouse. I am packing my bags tonight, and I am moving into a cheap studio apartment across town. We are done." The frantic energy drained right out of her body. The woman who had proudly laughed at my wife's memory took a stumbling step backward, her perfectly manicured hands falling uselessly to her sides. She looked around the dusty workshop, finally noticing the fresh stacks of cedar planks and the new brass plaque resting next to the scratched wooden box. Reality crashed over her like freezing water. Her shoulders slumped, and the sharp edge in her voice cracked into a thin, reedy whisper. "Calvin, please," Brittany begged, turning toward me with thick tears spilling over her dark lashes. "You cannot do this to us. We made a terrible mistake. I made a mistake. Just give us one more chance to prove we understand the value of this property." I looked at the weeping woman standing in the center of my garage. 3 weeks ago, watching her luxury empire crumble to dust would have brought a deep, burning satisfaction. Now, standing surrounded by the scent of fresh wood and the promise of a new beginning, the old urge to fight back was completely gone. The heavy exhaustion of dealing with her endless pursuit of status had replaced it. "You still do not understand what you threw away," I told her softly, shaking my head. "You look at this land, and you only see a bank account. You see collateral for loans and deposits for penthouses. But this house is not a currency, Brittany. It is a foundation built on 41 years of marriage." I reached out and picked up the heavy brass plaque. The cool metal caught the morning sunlight, highlighting Helen's final words deeply engraved into the surface. "The trust is already executed," I explained, gesturing toward the vocational director who was watching us quietly from the doorway. "The deed officially transferred to the Educational Foundation at 9 o'clock this morning. There is absolutely nothing left for you to take." She stared at the engraved letters on the plaque, her lips parting as the absolute finality of the situation settled into her mind. There would be no second chances, no legal loopholes, and no last-minute bailouts from a wealthy father-in-law. The massive wealth she had expected to inherit was gone forever, lost entirely because she could not look past a few scratches on a handmade gift. Without another word, Brittany turned around and walked slowly back to her idling vehicle. The powerful engine roared to life, and her tires spun aggressively against the gravel as she sped away from our neighborhood for the very last time. Evan let out a long, heavy breath, leaning his waist against the solid oak work table. We watched the white car disappear around the corner, and a profound, healing quiet washed over the property. "Are you ready for the fallout?" I asked my son. "I have to be," he answered, offering a small but genuine smile. "I have a mountain of debt to pay off, and a lot of terrible choices to fix. But I think I am finally heading in the right direction." 1 year passed in a blur of constant, rewarding labor. The old workshop transformed completely from a quiet storage shed into an active, bustling classroom. We installed bright new safety lights, upgraded the electrical wiring to handle heavy machinery, and brought in 5 heavy-duty workbenches for the incoming students. Evan drove over every single weekend, spending his days off sweeping sawdust, organizing wrenches, and painting the exterior walls. My son was living in a cramped apartment, working exhausting extra shifts to pay down his country club debts, but he looked healthier than he had in 10 years. He was earning back his self-respect, building it up one honest day of work at a time. On the crisp autumn morning, the foundation officially opened to the public. I walked into the garage before anyone else arrived. The cool air smelled heavily of fresh roasted coffee and newly cut pine boards. Dozens of hand tools hung perfectly organized along the freshly painted pegboards. Right in the center of the room, sitting safely behind a custom-built glass display case, was the handmade walnut box. I stood in front of the clear glass, pressing my palm against the cool surface. Helen and I had built that small container to hold our family's future, and in a strange, painful way, it had done exactly that. The scratched wooden box had protected our legacy from overwhelming greed, and it had forced our only son to find his own hidden strength. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the driveway, accompanied by the bright, nervous chatter of local teenagers arriving for their very first woodworking apprenticeship. I smiled, looking at the scratched wooden lid one last time before turning to face the door. The historic house was completely safe, the wood was ready to be shaped, and the true inheritance of our family was finally being passed on to hands that would treat it right. When you look back at the people who raised you, it is incredibly easy to take their sacrifices for granted. You walk through the doors they unlocked and stand on the floors they laid, often forgetting the sheer amount of sweat and heartache required to build that foundation. The story of the scratched wooden box is not just about a canceled real estate transfer or a broken marriage. It is a quiet warning about the dangerous illusion of modern wealth. We live in a world that constantly tells you to measure a person's worth by the brand of their clothes, the neighborhood they live in, and the price tag attached to their wedding reception. But true value rarely comes in a glossy package. When you judge the surface of a gift, you completely miss the love poured into its creation. The deepest acts of devotion usually carry scars. They look like faded work jackets, calloused hands, and small mistakes made by two people simply trying to build a life together. If you choose to mock those imperfections, you immediately prove that you do not have the character required to appreciate the sacrifices of the previous generation. Greed is a blinding force. It convinces you that you are entitled to the rewards of someone else's labor, whispering that respect is outdated and family history is just useless garbage waiting to be bulldozed. But entitlement always builds a house of cards. When the financial storms hit and the luxury bank loans are suddenly canceled, a relationship built entirely on status and materialism will collapse overnight. Yet, the hardest lesson here is not about the visible greed of a new bride. It is about the devastating cost of silence. When you see someone disrespecting your family, and you choose to look down at the floor, your silence becomes a weapon. Keeping the peace with an arrogant partner might seem like the easiest path, but it requires you to actively betray the people who gave you everything. Courage is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes, courage is just reaching out to take back a wooden box and saying that you will not tolerate the humiliation of your roots. If you lose your moral compass just to maintain a wealthy public image, you will eventually find yourself standing alone in an empty room, carrying nothing but debt and profound regret. However, redemption is always possible if you are willing to do the honest, exhausting work to earn it back. True inheritance is never a piece of paper sitting in an attorney's office. It is the integrity, the resilience, and the quiet dignity you pass down to the people willing to learn. Every family has something beautiful hidden beneath a rough, imperfect surface. Have you ever received a handmade gift that outsiders might not understand, but meant the absolute world to you? If you were standing in that lavish reception hall, would you have found the strength to speak up and defend your history, or would you have walked away to protect your own peace? Share your thoughts and your own personal family stories in the comments below, because the things we build with our own two hands are always worth defending.